Welcome, everyone. This is not a masquerade, and we are not clowning around. This is not in jest. This is the beginning of the eBay 20 item listing that we do every month, and we are very excited to show you the cool stuff we have. And let's start with this piece here, because this has an interesting history. If you remember, in the 1980s, people loved to hang these masks on their walls. You can see this little mark here that says Clay Art USA. I look for the American-made pieces. Clay Art is still making dinnerware in China today, but when it started out, the first product they made was a little hook that looked like a cherub's bottom with a hook coming out of it. And it was a pair of teachers at Mission High School in San Francisco who came up with that. They were named Michael Zanfagna and Jenny McLean, and they thought that it was cute and clever, and in 1979 they made a small batch of them, and they sold and were popular. Mission High School is between the Castro District and the Mission District in San Francisco, so it's a very urban high school. Their notable alum include Carlos Santana of the band Santana, as well as Vincent Delmonico, who invented Rice-A-Roni. So a few famous people besides these folks have come out of there. But clay art took off pretty quickly. They started making salt and pepper shakers that were very cute and whimsical, and then they came up with the idea of the masks, and the masks really hit the 1980s exactly square on. They were fun, they were different, there was a lot of jewelry being made in ceramics in the 1980s that looked like little masks, and people just really enjoyed them and started hanging them on their walls, hanging them in the bedroom, and it became quite a thing. The jester is one of the more popular ones. They typically had extra adornments like the bells and the ribbons and this sort of thing, and the American era of production lasted through the 1980s and into the 1990s. And at some point, like everybody else, they realized that at the volume they were doing, it was hard to find California ceramics that could be made in this quantity and be price competitive, and so it went over to China. The collectors are catching on to the Clay Art USA pieces specifically now, and people, again, I keep being asked, what from the 80s should we be looking for? Well, these are starting to sell pretty well. There were lots of other companies that jumped into the market, particularly around New Orleans, where the masquerade balls are very popular, but Clay Art of San Francisco really gets the credit for being the progenitor of the style. This particular piece is going to go on eBay now, and I suspect that it will probably sell in the $40 to $50 range. The Jester is one of the more popular ones. They made some really elaborate ones with huge feather headdresses, and those can sell for a few $100s. And I think the market is only beginning to really catch on to these, so I think it's a fun area that we will watch over the next several years as it grows into a more commonly collected and more widespread interest for people. The colors are really fun. They tend to be jewel tones. The faces are really quite beautiful in the way they're done. And so Clay Art USA, that's the name that I'm looking for now. Now, this next piece is something that will resonate with a whole lot of people who remember when this was the car most people had. This plate is from Chevrolet, and it says America's Choice for 18 years. It has the bow tie logo that Chevy started using in 1913. It was the brainchild of a fellow named William Durant. And William Durant had worked to put together a bunch of different car companies and create General Motors. He was the one who figured out that if you had different brands that appealed to different customers and different price points, you could make a giant auto firm. He also was the person who came up with the idea of having dealers sell the cars instead of being sold direct. And by franchising to dealers, he was able to spread the production all over the country and quickly establish the General Motors brands. He bought Buick in 1908, he bought Cadillac, he bought Oldsmobile, and he bought a company called Oakland that became the Pontiac car line. But Chevrolet was the one car that he made on his own, because he was in and out of General Motors a few times. He would start to build it up. He'd get overextended. The board of directors would throw him out. Then he would gain control again, and then he would come up with another car. Chevrolet was a race car driver from France, Louis Chevrolet. And because he was a race car driver, he had notoriety. And because he had notoriety, he was a good person to partner with. And they decided to use his name on the cars. In fact, I think Louis Chevrolet ego demanded that they use his name on the cars. Louis Chevrolet was sort of a hothead. He only lasted 3 years in the business, and then Durant bought him out, used the profits from Chevrolet to get back into General Motors and assume control again. And by 1918, General Motors was a really, really big concern. And within 10 years, Chevrolet had overtaken Ford as the top selling car in the country. Chevrolets went from being the stuff of race cars to being the stuff of family cars during that time. And so it became America's choice. So this piece was made in 1936, and it was made by the Warwick China Company in Ohio. Warwick did a lot of transfer wear. Now this one was a little bit of a factory second. You can see there's a little bit up on the rim above the M in America's Choice that isn't quite all there. So this was not a perfect factory specimen when it was made, but this piece is really hard to find. It was given out during the Depression to remind people that Chevrolet was the brand of choice and also to try to get people back into the showrooms. In 1929, a Chevrolet cost $1,000, $1,200 range, and by the time this plate was made, which was only 6 or 7 years later, a new car cost about half that because there was huge deflation during the Depression. The value of everything really plummeted. And because of that, to make any money, they really needed to do volume. So this was to remind people that Chevrolet was the big number one car, and they stayed that way. Chevys outsold Ford every single year between 1927 and 1958, and in 1959, Ford outsold Chevy for the first time in decades. This plate is definitely a hard thing to find. I've looked everywhere to try to find a comparable. I have not been able to find one for sale anywhere. I don't think they probably made a whole lot. I'm sure it was something that the dealers gave out, hoping that they would get people to pick them up. And because it was a dinner plate, and this might sound strange, but they were starting to catch on to the idea that women drove too. And there was even a car called the Jordan that was made that was specifically aimed at women. Dinner plates were typically more the province back then of the housewife. And I think the idea was that women would see this and think that maybe they should have a car as well. We're putting this on eBay right now. I'm not really sure where it should go. Most of these are going to have buy it now prices, but that one is not, because when I find something that I haven't seen, I figure that I need to let the marketplace tell me what it's worth. This next piece is a personal favorite of mine. I just think this is the coolest thing. Owls, of course, are very popular now. Paperweights are very popular now, and the controlled bubble on this is what I think is really special. It's very well controlled. You notice the rows are very even. The way they make these paperweights is the inside is a dome, and then the bubbles are put in, and then another layer is cased over it, and that is how you make a paperweight. This paperweight has a really interesting heritage because this paperweight is by one of the Moretti brothers. Carlo and Giovanni Moretti started their own shop in Venice in 1958, and the Moretti shops are still making glass in Venice. They make all sorts of wonderful cased glass beverage ware and stemware primarily these days. But there were many Moretti brothers, and two of them came to the United States, Alessandro in 1956 and Roberto in 1958, and they were hired to do the designs for a fledgling company out of West Virginia called Pilgrim Glass Company. There is the Pilgrim hand-blown glass label. This is the 1960s and 70s label, which is when this piece was made. Their earlier labels are rectangular and show a glass blower with a big glass blowing pipe. Pilgrim Glass, for about the first 15 years, are based on Murano glass designs by glassblowers who originally worked for Benini and Seguso and all the famous Italian companies. And because of that, I think Pilgrim Glass is really undervalued right now. A piece like this recently sold for $30. Now, it was clear, and the clear don't sell for as much as the colored. But it was amazing to me to think, because if it was a paperweight by any Venetian glass company, you would probably put a 1 in front of that figure. It might have sold for $130. This is from the late 1960s. The color is really great. The fact that it's an owl is really fun. And look at that design. It's so modernist. Pilgrim Glass knew they were onto something when the brothers came to work for them, and they actually sponsored Alessandro Moretti to be the glass blower at the 1964 to 65 New York World's Fair, because the owner of Pilgrim Glass, even though it was based in West Virginia, his company, Nobler Designs, his name was Alfred Nobler, and I met him when we were involved with Pilgrim Glass and selling their items through our factory outlet center in Centralia, Washington. He was from New York, and he really understood that the New York market wanted modernism, and they wanted things that had a pedigree, and he caught on that Italian design was going to be the thing, and it worked. Pilgrim Glass ended up being a rather big going concern. They made a lot of really great stuff, and so Pilgrim Glass, in my mind, is a really fun thing to collect, and it isn't as well known yet as Blanco Glass or even Viking, but it absolutely was back in its time, and I think people who are serious glass collectors should give this some thought. I believe the price of this should be somewhere around the $60 level today. I believe the price of this could certainly go higher than that in the future. I'm never one to promise that there's investment value in glass pieces, but Pilgrim is definitely a company I would be looking for if I were starting a collection today. I was very excited to find this at an estate sale in Ohio because I had this exact car when I was a little kid. And like most little kids back then, we ripped them out of the boxes, we threw the box away, and we played with our little car. And this is the Matchbox number 19 Lotus racing car. This is one of the original 75. And this one would have come out in 1965, the same year I came out. This piece, if you open up in here, is in really good shape. It was made by the Lesney Company. Lesney came up with these in the 1950s. They were a die-cast toy company in England, and they were making larger models. And the daughter of one of the founders was going to a school, and this was typical in England, where you could bring a toy to school, but it couldn't be any bigger than a matchbox. So he came up with the idea of scaling these down to where they would fit in a matchbox. This is the original yellow and white design. They restyled these and changed the colors a couple of years later. By the 1960s, Matchboxes were doing really, really well. This is a few years before Hot Wheels came out. This one has the bigger tires that rolled a little bit better, and because of that, it was appropriate for the race car. And they also were starting to do figures on the inside. They were doing windows. They were doing interiors. So they had really improved a lot since the early 50s when they were very basic. Matchbox also wanted things to be very realistic. They would go and take pictures of these cars and then scale their models off of them. Sometimes they would even get the blueprints from the automobile manufacturers, and they ended up making designs that were based on cars all over the world. So they became very popular in the United States as well. They weren't just doing British cars after a while. They were doing American cars, they were doing French cars, they were doing Italian cars, and so they ended up with quite a wonderful business. Ironically enough, eventually Mattel, which owns Hot Wheels, ended up being the owner of Matchbox. But this is back when it was an independent product made in England. The Racer is a pretty good car. I believe that this sells somewhere in the $45 to $50 range, and we're going to find out together. So we'll put it on eBay right now and see where the listing goes. We're going to stay in England for this next piece, and this next piece is a really cool figurine that I like because of its realism. This is by the Beswick Company, or in England, people often call it Beswick, including a lot of the people who worked at this factory. They started in 1894, but this has this oval mark on the bottom, Beswick, England, and that tells us it's from sometime between 1952 and the 1960s decade. The lion came out as part of a line that started in the late 1930s, where they started doing wild animals, as well as race horses, as well as domestic animals like dogs and cats. And they had a designer named Arthur Gredington who decided that this would be a good direction for the company to go. It was something different than the other companies in England were doing. And they had a decorator named John Hayward who said, well, then we need to make them as realistic as possible. And to that end, much as Matchbox did with their cars, Beswick would have people take pictures of wild animals. They would have them go out into nature and study these animals, and they would try to make these pieces, both in the decoration and the molding, the sculpting of the piece, as realistic as they possibly could. And this guy's a pretty good-looking lion. They started using fine bone china in the 1930s as well, and so it's a good quality ware. And because of that, there's a lot of people who collect this. Beswick was taken over by Royal Dalton in 1969 because their Beatrix Potter figurines were so successful that Dalton decided that they wanted to have some of that action, at which point Royal Dalton became the mark on most of the Beswick pieces. So this piece would only have been made in the 1950s and 60s. He's in wonderful condition. He's got a great mane. We know it's a he because he has a mane. And we are going to put him out and see where the market takes him. I just think this piece is really handsome. Our next piece is also a ceramic animal, but this one's a little less serious because this one is a bright purple cow. And, oh yes, those are some udders on it. This lady has some really soulful eyes and is all hand-painted and was done by a company called Brighton out of Laguna Beach, California. And Brighton Laguna was the Laguna Beach pottery company that ended up being the biggest and most successful in Laguna Beach. Laguna Beach was an area that was a roadside tourist attraction on the way to San Juan Capistrano Mission. People driving down the Pacific Coast Highway would stop there, and there were lots of little pottery companies that formed there. It turned out to be a really good place to do it because tourists would buy pieces along the way, and so by the 1930s, it was a big tourist destination where you would buy California pottery. Mr. Brayton started his company, and then in 1936, he remarried a woman by the name of Webb Grieve, and Webb was the one who said, you know, it's nice that we're doing these little studio figures, but we need to make this a serious pottery manufacturing company. All the other little Laguna Beach potteries were really small and they just maintained little studios, but Brighton Laguna, they made a big factory with 2 continuous tunnel kilns and they hired a bunch of workers, and it paid off because they got a contract with Disney and became the first company to make Walt Disney figures. On the success of those, they started looking for other whimsy figures that they could make. And you notice this one doesn't have any sort of a mark on it. They didn't mark these pieces. The purple cow was done in the 1940s as a whimsy piece based on a poem done in 1896 by a guy named Gelett Burgess, who wrote a 4-line poem saying, I've never seen a purple cow, I never wish to see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one. That ended up being the most quoted poem other than Jingle Bells, of all things, in the 20th century. And the purple cow since then recently has become the focus of a marketing guru's book talking about how you want to have something that really stands out in the marketplace. And so purple cow is again recently in the parlance of people who are in the marketing industry. So the purple cow is really cute. It's really fun. They typically sell in the $50 range, more or less. We're going to see how this one does. But I just thought it was such a great thing, and they're not actually that commonly found. There is a bull as well. The bull is even harder to find than the cow. Strangely enough, there have been 2 incidents of people seeing actual purple spotted cows, and it seems to be some sort of a genetic defect that comes up about once every 50 years in nature. So yes, there really is a purple cow. When I was in Ohio, I found this little box at an estate sale, and you would think, well, why would you buy an empty box? Well, this is an empty box of Peters Cartridge Company bullets made for Smith & Wesson. These are 32 caliber, and these would have been made about 1910. And cartridge boxes are pretty collectible. This is the reason that I picked this up. It's a little damaged on one side from being opened. Otherwise, it's in pretty great shape. Peters Cartridge Company was in Kings Mills, Ohio. And the site has been renovated. It was a super fun site, and they spent a bunch of money cleaning it out because all the various chemicals and minerals you have to use to make these bullets had befouled the place. But the buildings were really cool, and it has been renovated, and there's now a big brew pub there, and the tap handles all look like bullets. So they definitely kept that part going. But this was a very important business in Ohio at the time. In fact, it was very important all the way through the Second World War. It lasted until 1944 because a large military ordnance, in other words, ammunition depot, was built right next to it. And so Peter's cartridge is very well known in the Ohio area particularly, and you see that they mark this Cincinnati, Ohio. It is, in fact, in an area between Cincinnati and Dayton. So there's a lot of collectors there. That's where I found this piece. I usually expect these to sell around $20 a piece. And part of the reason I wanted to show you this is just so that you know empty boxes can be worth money, just like we were talking about with the Matchbox that people took out the contents and threw them away. Well, that would have been the same with this product. So to find one still in existence these days, not such an easy thing to do. This piece is really interesting to me because this is Goofus glass, and Goofus is a name that collectors ascribe to it later, but these really had pattern glass names. I believe that this one was done by Indiana Glass and is one of the sculpted roses. You can see the roses there. This is the first attempt to do glass that has an iridescence on it, and was a way to take pattern glass and turn it into something that was at least proximate to what Tiffany was doing in glass around the 1890s, where he was trying to make glass look like metal with his finishes. So this is enameling, but it's unfired, meaning that it's not baked in, it's just sprayed on. And that was a problem because it would wear off really easily. So finding Goofus glass pieces in good condition is really hard. You can see a little bit of a nick there in the coloring and a little bit of wear on some of the high points of the roses. But this one is in remarkable condition because most of the gold is still on there. And that is not a maker mark on the bottom. That's just various seams and straw marks and things from the production process. Goofus glass, a lot of people think is not attractive now because they're used to seeing it in horrible condition. But when you see it with all of the color on it, it's actually very pretty. And it was considered very nice in its time, and it was considered a high-end product. But then it didn't wear very well, and so shortly after that, the pattern glass company switched to Carnival glass. Much like Carnival glass, which was also an iridescence, but that was sprayed on, and the metallic oxide was sprayed and fired at a low temperature so that it wouldn't wear off as fast like this stuff wore. Well, Carnival glass and Goofus glass, both in the late teens, early 20s, went out of style. Tiffany started to make different things, and so suddenly the idea of making glass that looked like it had a metallic sheen was no longer the taste, and so they started selling this to fairs and carnivals as prizes, and that's how they liquidated the stock that was left. And so Goofus glass and Carnival glass both ended up being very widespread across the country, but also were not given very much thought, and because of that, a lot of the pieces of Goofus glass are very, very worn, and finding it in good condition is the key. This is a miniature oil lamp. People use these as little night lights, as something to carry around with them if they were getting up in the middle of the night, and as little reading lamps. And this, of course, is in the era when not everybody has electricity. This one does have its original wick, and so it has everything it needs to be used. It's in complete, intact, and very good condition for what it is. And because of that, I expect that this might sell between $50 and $75. We're going to put it on eBay right now and find out together. So we're putting all of these items on eBay auction. We thank our members on the level 2 and level 3 membership levels that make this possible. Their contributions make it possible for us to take the time to do the research, to do these deeper dives, and to produce these extra videos. And so they do get first access. So if you want early access to this video, please check out the membership listing information below the dash line in any of our videos. Lots of people took candid photos and little snapshots in the 1950s and 60s era with their little brownie cameras and took them to the developer. And lots of people like to collect photographs, and most of them are just family members doing whatever people did. And they're cute for that reason. Sometimes people will find ones that have interesting looking people or a car that they remember or that sort of thing. This batch is something a little different, because if you look at the pencil mark on there, March 1964, Anchorage, Alaska, 9.2 magnitude. March 27th was the 60th anniversary of the 1964 Alaska earthquake that hit just east of Anchorage, Alaska, and caused a tsunami that was so big and so bad that it destroyed most of Crescent City, California. It made the Space Needle shake 1,200 miles away. It was felt by seismographs in 47 out of 50 states. It was a giant earthquake. Here is a photo company that says business as usual, more or less, in spite of early breakup. The breakup in Alaska is when the snow and the frost go away and the snow all breaks up and it's a big muddy mess and everything melts, and then it's finally spring in Alaska. Well, this was March, and you see there's still snow on everything because that's still winter in Alaska. Well, the breakup this time looked a little bit more like this, because the breakup was the thrusting of various pieces of earth. There was movement as much as 8 feet, where things would drop 8 feet or be raised 8 feet. So there's this Volkswagen that was parked in front of that house at one time, and now it's not anymore. This is a really fascinating group because these are candid photos. These have never been published before. Some of them are going to be similar to photos that were published at the time, and some of them were just somebody walking around and showing houses leaning sideways, showing houses knocked off of their foundation, showing the J.C. Penney's building, which has pretty much collapsed on one side. This earthquake only lasted 5.5 minutes, and it did incredible damage because it was so severe. There's another house that's fallen. Here is where the Alaska Curio Shop has dropped in elevation below street level. Here's another building, an apartment building. The 1964 Alaska earthquake really led to a change in building standards, and thankfully only 131 people died because Anchorage was small at that time and far away from other people. Had this happened in a more populated area, the devastation would have been much worse. Here's another apartment block that appears to be splitting in half. These are just really fascinating to me, and a lot of people who collect this sort of thing will be fascinated with this too, especially because, again, these were taken by an amateur photographer, so some of these images may never have been seen before. And it is the 60th anniversary of this event, and Anchorage is a much larger city now, and there's a lot more interest and awareness in seismology than there was at this time. There is an Edsel. This makes this one doubly interesting. There's the Penny's building collapsed in the background, and you've got an Edsel on the street. More destruction. It's really very frightening to see. There are several more of these, and I will show you. There also are a few candid shots of some folks who I think have gathered together and are probably living under one roof because they are refugees from the earthquake. These young children, they're camped out on the floor of someone else's house and having a good time. So you see a little bit of the human interest of this as well. I think this is a really interesting collection, and we are going to put it up at a low price, and this is another one where I don't know how to price this. We are going to let the market tell us where the value of this is, because I think that it has some pretty significant value because of the nature of what it depicts. The original sleeve with its picture-taking tips. Well, I think the earthquake made number 3 and 4 a little bit difficult, but They got us some interesting photos, and 60 years later, I think someone's going to have a really interesting time looking through those and adding them to their collection. The California missions became a very big point of historic interest and tourist interest in the 1910s, and the arts and crafts style of the era ended up being called mission style because it was very rudimentary. And Weller saw the opportunity, the Weller Pottery Company of Ohio, to celebrate that by making their claywood line, which was a very basic intaglio designed line with brushed on glaze on a simple buff clay body, into a line of mission ware. And there are two different ones that I know of, and there may be more in this series, of these California mission jardinières. A jardinière is basically a big planter. And this one is California missions, and they are showing the mission at El Carmel and at San Gabriel. It's a really interesting piece. You just don't see these ever. The one that you see more often is the one with Santa Barbara on it, and that one oftentimes has a green glaze that was done later. This one was vitrified on the inside, so it has a glass glaze so that you could actually use it as a planter and have it not leak, because the outside is not glazed at all. It is a brushed on coloration. They called this the claywood line. They did not mark a lot of these pieces. Later on, they might have had a Weller typewriter-looking embossed stamp on the bottom, but this was an early one, probably from around 1910 to 1915. We just never see these pieces anymore. This is a good piece of pottery, and particularly if you are from California or are interested in the California missions. And part of the reason that I'm listing it now is because I'm going to be shipping these from Seattle, and I think that the customer is more likely to be on the West Coast, although there is interest in this all over the country, anywhere you have old Spanish trail architecture. I think that the likelihood is this will end up in California, and it will be easier to ship because it is a big, heavy piece. I believe the value of this is somewhere in the 175 to 225 range, and we're going to find out together. I was in Mexico City recently. I'm sure that a lot of you folks who follow me saw at least one of the videos on our main channel, and I had such a good time there and saw some really amazing, beautiful, true antiques, things that are very rare and hard to find that we really don't see much anymore. But I also spent a little time with my friend going to Palacio de Hielo. I think that's the pronunciation. It is a big department store, and it is a very fancy department store, and it has a lot of little departments in it, and each department is dedicated to a particular company, and one of the companies that was sold there was Lalique. And Lalique Glass was showing glass in color. One shelf that they had was this color. This is not Lalique, but Lalique is showing this exact color in their brand new 2024 line. And this color is, in this case, Fostoria pink from the 1920s and 30s. This same exact shade is being made in Lalique glass in 2024. So 100 years later, we are starting to see this pink glass coming back into fashion. And I'm very excited about it because a lot of companies like Fostoria, which was originally an Ohio company and then moved to West Virginia when the natural gas ran out. See, this is the thing with glass companies, they need to be near natural gas sources because that's what they use. That and electricity is what fires the kilns. And so if the natural gas runs out, the glass company runs out unless they find more natural gas. So they moved to West Virginia, and that's where they made all of these beautiful pieces, even though Fostoria is named after its original Ohio town that it started in. This is the Versailles pattern. Look at that very strong etching. It's really a very beautiful piece. The shaping is very nice. This is a console bowl. There would have been candlesticks you could buy to go with this. That is the color that Lalique is showing this year. And I find it so interesting that they're going back to these colors that the depression glass collectors, and especially the elegant depression glass collectors, really, really loved. 30 years ago, this stuff was super popular. I'm expecting this piece will sell somewhere in the $40 to $50 range today. It used to be that this piece would have sold for almost double that. So I think if you're a collector today and you like this color, or if you're a decorator today and you're saying, this looks good with all of these gray interiors that we've painted the past several years, this is an area to look for now. Versailles was one of Fostoria's most collected patterns because it's got such detail and it's very good quality. And so I think people will start to really enjoy these again. And now's the chance for someone to enjoy this one. This little tray here is an interesting and sad reminder of a terrible, terrible battle in World War I. Verdun in France was the place that the Germans and the French spent the most lives, the most ammunition, the most casualties happened there. 300,000 people died at Verdun in 11 months of siege in 1916. 800,000 casualties was the low estimate. The high estimate was 1.4 million. The French soldier there is shedding tears at Verdun, and the French soldier in Paris is looking on with fear because the Germans, with the Iron Cross you see in the middle, are going to take Verdun and then march their way to Paris. Well, that wasn't really what the battle was about. The battle, unfortunately, the Germans realized they were not breaking through the line. And so the only thing that they could think to do was to keep fighting there and hopefully bleed the French by having so much attrition that they would eventually make their way through. This is the reason that the United States dropped its isolationist ways and entered World War I. Against the wishes of almost a majority of Americans at the time. The stalemate along the lines was so horrible, and the loss of life was so horrible, that Woodrow Wilson became convinced that we had to go in and turn the tide of the war, which we did. There's still a lot of argument amongst historians as to whether that was a good idea or not, but that, in fact, is what happened, and this tray is a sad but poignant reminder of that very, very vicious and horrible event in world history. Trench art, war memorabilia, all of these things are very collectible because so many people's parents, grandparents, great-grandparents were involved in these battles in the various wars that we have had over history, and a lot of military collectors look for this sort of thing. And so we're going to put this one on. I don't think I have a buy it now on this because, again, we don't see these all that often, and so we're going to let the market tell us what the collector interest in this is now. Similarly, before we go on to happier things, we have this lot, which I'm selling together as a lot, and these are Civil War covers. When you say a cover is essentially an envelope, so there is the envelope on the back. But on the front of these, they have printed various anti-Confederate symbology. The one in the middle has an 1861 date, and you would buy these and send them to your friends if you lived up in the north to show your support for the war and your feelings about what had happened when the South seceded. This is Jefferson Davis. They show him going into the war. And then if you turn it sideways, they show him coming out of the war as a horse's ass. That's the idea behind this one. So it's a trick of the eye there. Jefferson Davis did not actually have a long beard like that, but they were using a little creative license. This one says, to cure rebellion, this is the pill that will cure or kill. This one was printed in Philadelphia, the other two were in New York. And of course, this little pill happens to be a bomb. It's a play on words, good news for traitors. And inside, I'm sure, would have been some letter talking about how you were hoping that your side was going to win the Civil War. These are not in perfect condition. As you can see, this one has some crinkling. There's a little bit of a loss on the bottom of the one with Jefferson Davis there. But It's really more about the collectability because of the interest among Civil War collectors. And Civil War collectibles seems to always remain hot in the marketplace. So we're selling these three as a lot. I believe that we're starting them at $19 for the three. A lot of people have never seen these, and so I think it will be fun to see who the ultimate collector is, but a very interesting piece of American history here. Fortunately, wars end, and after the end of the Second World War, there was a huge change in consumer tastes and modernism came to the fore. This is a Raymore piece. And you think, oh, Raymore, well, it must be made in Italy. Well, surprise! Irving Richards was a very interesting man. He had a bookstore in New York in the 1920s. It was his first successful business, and he went to Paris on a buying trip. And he went to a place called Salon des Automnes. I hope I'm getting that anywhere close to the right pronunciation. Renoir and Rodin and others of the Impressionists had helped to form as a counterbalance to the Paris Salon, which was very old-fashioned and did not want Impressionism. And as the Salon des Automnes became more important and more widely recognized, it also became the place that a lot of modern design was done. And so he went there, saw what they were selling, got very interested in modern design and wanted to be involved in that. So when he came back to the United States, he got involved with Russell Wright and his wife, and they came out with the American Modern line of dinnerware around 1941. And that was the beginning of the Raymore Company. American Modern was made by Steubenville, China, and it became very successful, but he did not have an exclusive on it. He decided to start commissioning other companies all over the world. American companies, Italian companies, which is where a lot of this Potosi pottery that is marked Raymore came from. Irving Richards' motto for Raymore was modernism in the tradition of good taste, and I think he really hit that, and I think that's why so many people are interested in anything marked Raymore now, whether it's the dinnerware, whether it's the Italian pottery designs from the 60s and 70s. He kept having things made all the way up until 1980, so collecting anything Raymore, if you're a mid-century modern kind of person, is definitely going to be something that will work together and be really fun looking together. This one is Raymore by Roseville. Yes, the same Roseville pottery that made all of those floral vases and things made this design in 1952. And it was way ahead of its time. Roseville Pottery had made a juvenile line and some minor dinnerware pieces back in the 19-teens and 20s, but they were not known as a dinnerware maker and hadn't made anything like this in decades. Well, their floral vases, as pretty as they were, had gone out of style. They had introduced a new line called Roseville Silhouette of planters and vases, but they really needed another product. And in the 1950s, there was renewed interest in homemaking, in having parties. They hired a designer named Ben Seibel. This is one of the first lines he did. Ben Seibel was an interesting guy. He had studied sculpture at the Pratt Institute in New York, and this Roseville Raymore was so popular when it came out in 1952 that they then hired him to create an artware line of vases and things that they were used to making. This particular charcoal color did not come out until 1953 when the artware line came out. This was not one of the original Raymore dinnerware colors. Well, Roseville unfortunately had quality control problems, and they were not used to making dinnerware. It was very hard for them to shift over to this production. And 1954 was a very bad recession year. And between all of that, Roseville went out of business. So the Raymore line, as cool as it is and as desirable as it is by mid-century collectors, only was made for 2 years or 2.5. And this black color was made an even shorter period of time. So this is actually a very hard piece to find. You don't see big serving pieces very often. The condition on this is really, really good. I believe it's worth somewhere in the $200 range, and we're going to find out together. None of these have traded in a long time that I've been able to see, and none of them have been in this color. I think this little guy is just great. He is a little alligator. He is a letter opener. He's been used a few times. His tail is a little bit rough at the end. He's definitely got some patina from where people held him, but he was originally given out by the Independent Stove Company as an advertising piece sometime around 1910. Independent Stove was a company that was started by a couple of people who broke off from Michigan Stove Company in Detroit. They wanted to make their own stoves. They thought they could do it a little bit better. And they went to the town of Owasso, Michigan, and Owasso said, if you guarantee that you will spend $50,000 a year on payroll for the next 5 years, we will give you 3 acres of land right next to the railroad tracks. Well, that was very important because these are old wood and coal burning stoves, and they were really, really heavy, made out of iron. A lot of people don't realize that Detroit was already a city of almost 500,000 people before the auto industry took off, and big cast iron items like stoves were one of their major industries. And so Wasso was very happy to get these folks to come in, and these folks were very happy to make their stoves there, and they did very well for a number of years until coal and wood-fired stoves went away, and then people wanted something else. But this little alligator guy is just great. The collector for this is going to be somebody who likes early advertising or somebody who just thinks alligators are cool. And I sure do. I have to admit, I had a moment of wanting to keep him because he's just got such a great little body and face, and he's obviously been used a lot over time because you can see the patina and the way that it's more worn on the top surface. I just think he's very charming. I think someone else will too, so we're going to let him slither off to another place, and we will put him up right now and see where he goes. Sometimes the interaction between cultures gives us amazing, wonderful products, amazing, wonderful inventions, amazing diffusion of cultures and tastes and flavors, and sometimes those cultures butt up against each other and give us pain and strife. And unfortunately, this next collectible item, which is not terribly old, only about a decade, is an example of the latter of those. This is the commemorative issue of Charlie Hebdo that came out the week after the editor and 11 of the other people who worked there were murdered by al-Qaeda operatives in Paris. Charlie Hebdo was and remains a satirical magazine, and one of the prices of free speech is that sometimes people who disagree with what you have to say will take exception to what you have to say, and sometimes they will do something about it. Al-Qaeda operatives had firebombed the Charlie Hebdo offices in 2011, and the editor, who is a gentleman by the name of Stéphane Charbonneau, said, well, I think that we have to make equal fun of all different faiths so that people understand that there is pluralism and that there is freedom. And unfortunately, he ended up giving his life for that cause. The week after, this publication, which usually only printed 60,000 copies in French and distributed in France, published 8 million of these in 7 different languages. And the cover says, "All is forgiven, I am Charlie." And you see that the depiction is not of Muhammad, but of someone of the Muslim faith who is saying that they are in solidarity with this newspaper. And interestingly enough, about half of the Muslim world actually expressed solidarity with the people who produced this newspaper after the attack happened. Half of the Muslim world felt otherwise. And that struggle between fundamentalism and the modern world is not unique to that religion, but has certainly been a topic in our lifetime. And you see various cartoons on the back essentially all saying, our pencils are stronger than your bullets. So this was a very controversial thing when it came out, and a real surprise because a lot of people figured that the publication would just shut down and that would be the end of it. And instead, they continued on. And this edition is rather valuable because of it. This actually typically sells on eBay for $30 to $50, sometimes more, and we're going to put this up and find out what the market is now. I like to talk about these things because on my own channel I am a proponent of free speech, and I also am a proponent of showing various sides of issues and topics, and I don't tend to shy away from these things because I think it's important for all of us to have a greater understanding of each other. There definitely were people in the Muslim world who were understandably very upset by their depiction of Muhammad having a bomb in his beard because they felt that it defiled Muhammad, and that is something that is sacrilege in their religion. However, they are equal opportunity. They have also done various things that were considered sacrilegious by the Catholic Church. And so this is the question in our world today, is not just do you have the right to your opinion, but do you have the right to express it? And I know how I feel about that for myself, and I will leave you to ponder that and be the judge of that for yourself. This next item is so cute and sweet and happy, and after some of the topics we've been addressing today, we could use some sweet and happy, and this one is a cute little stoneware duck done by the Pigeon Forge Pottery. The grandfather had been a potter in England, and when the Ferguson family started the pottery in 1946, they started it in a converted tobacco shed in the tourist area between Gatlinburg and Sevierville up in Tennessee, in Pigeon Forge, and it was a great success. But most of their production was just sold to tourists at the site and in small shops in the area. So even though Pigeon Forge is collected nationally in the United States, most of the distribution was just in Tennessee at the time that it was made. They kept producing through 1999, and there's a lot of signatures on the bottom. They had stamped signatures, especially on their higher volume lines like the dogwood, but when they did the flora and fauna lines, those were usually based on local critters like this, and they were signed with an incised mark on the bottom, as you see. Sometimes they even have the signature of the potter, and some of those signatures are worth more because they have the potter's signature on them. I just think he's so cute. I like the glaze. And I wanted to show him partly because if you saw Jocelyn at Crazy Lamp Lady's video where we were shopping in a big antique mall in Ohio, she found a piece called Pigeon River Pottery that was very similar to this. Well, the Pigeon River Pottery operates in the same area. They're making very similar stoneware, and they're making a lot of the same designs. And it appears that some of the people who were employed by and had worked around Pigeon Forge then went off and started their own pottery after the Ferguson family shut their pottery down in 1999. So there does seem to be a connection. I believe we're starting this little duckling at only $19.99, and we will see where it swims off to, but it is a happy, happy thing for spring. And while we're on happy bird figures, our next figure is this one, and this one is a Leo Ward figure. Leo Ward and the Terra Studios stopped producing these, so they are no longer in production. We've had a lot of people collecting and buying and selling the Bluebirds of Happiness online. This is the Pink Bird of Hope. And how did they get those names? Well, Terra Studios, when they first started making these back in the early 1980s, a lot of their distribution was to hospital gift stores. Terra Studios is a 6-acre workshop and art facility in northwestern Arkansas near Fayetteville, and they are still there, but they decided in 2019, because of concerns about fossil fuels, to stop producing the birds and to not produce glass pieces in that manner until they could find some more sustainable way to do it. Leo Ward was the founder. His signature is found oftentimes on these, and you can see there Leo Ward, and they're typically dated. I believe this one says it is 2002. You do not see the Pink Bird of Hope nearly as much as you see the Blue Bird of Happiness, and that's the reason I wanted to present this piece. They seem like they sell for just a little bit more than the Bluebirds of Happiness because they're harder to find. They made 8 million of the Bluebirds of Happiness, which is a pretty incredible number for a fairly small studio to have made. But it was their main product for years and years. But you don't see the pink as often. You don't see the red cardinals as often either. And so I thought it was a nice time with spring here to bring this out for some collector to have in their roost. I've just ended my Florida season, but I thought it would be fun to bring something besides the alligator that has a Florida connection. I have a friend in Florida who I went shopping with, who you might have seen in a recent video with me, and she buys enamelware. And I found this cute little piece of enamelware subsequently at a different estate in Florida, and it's enamel on copper. And it has a nice little handle. It's a little side pour for, probably drawn butter or sauces of some sort. But it has the name Necrosoft on the bottom. And Necrosoft was Sergei Necrosoft. He fled the Russian Revolution on foot in 1917 and walked all the way to Germany. He then ended up in Paris. He was a cab driver, and while he was a cab driver, he started studying metalsmithing, and he learned all sorts of things about enameling and working with various metals. Well, originally, he worked in pewter, and by the time he got to the United States in the 1930s, he opened up a very successful shop in Darien, Connecticut. And of course, there's a lot of interest in New England in pewter items because it harkens back to colonial design. And so he was very happily working there. Then the Second World War came. We did not have access to tin. A lot of metal was going into scrap drives, and he had to close the company because he could not get the materials. Well, after the Second World War, he moved to Florida, and he still couldn't get the materials for pewter, so he decided to strictly make copper enameled pieces. And this is at a time when enameling on copper is a fairly new idea for a lot of Americans, so he was a bit ahead of his time. Sasha Brostoff hadn't started doing his yet, and Bovano and a lot of the other companies, Anne-Marie Davidson, those makers did not exist yet. So Necrosoft was ahead of his time, and in his studio in Stuart, Florida, he made a lot of these pieces. They always have a white center. That was one of his trademarks. So you see the white at the bottom and then this wonderful green with the speckling. I just think it's really well made. He lived to be 90 years old, and his son and he did a lot of these pieces in Florida. And they discontinued these sometime, I believe, in the 1970s. At one time, his pieces sold in Neiman Marcus and a lot of big department stores, so there are collectors who know him all over the place. And that brings us to our last piece, and I have to say I am so delighted to have a piece of this to show you. I have never owned a piece before. This has been on my bucket list for a long time. And this is a piece of Clarice Cliff bizarreware. This one is one of the cottage style ones. This is called Circle Tree. This is one that she developed in the 1930s, and you can see the tree with the circles. Clarice Cliff was a quite remarkable woman. There is the mark on the bottom, and this shows it was done for the Newport pottery. It's part of the Fantasque line, and it's called Bizarreware. There's Bizarre by Clarice Cliff. This has all sorts of good marks on it. It's got the mold name in the George pattern, number 564, which is the shape, this picture with this very Art Deco style. She was so far ahead of her time in a number of ways. Most of the potters, they wanted to make more money, and so you picked one skill and you did it until you got really good at it, and then you would get a raise and a promotion, and you would stay on the line doing the same thing forever. If you were an enameler, you did enameling. If you were a painter, you did painting. If you were a mold maker, you made molds. She wanted to understand everything there was to understand about making pottery, and so she shifted from job to job to job. She worked for the Wilkinson Potteries, who had the Newport line and some other lines, and she got a hold of some of their seconds and started painting them with very vibrant Art Deco designs, geometrics. She would take a piece that had a factory flaw and she'd paint orange triangles and do these really crazy shapes on top of them. And the decorating department manager saw this skill, saw that she was doing something really useful for them, and introduced her to Alan Shorter, who was the head of production for the pottery company. Mr. Shorter was so impressed with her skill that he dedicated a portion of the pottery company to her and allowed her to hire ultimately a group of 60-some women and 4 men to make her lines. She did all the modeling, all the molding of the shape. She came up with the lines. She instructed and taught the people how to do the decorations. Well, part of the reason Mr. Shorter was so willing to do this is that he was quite fond of her and the feeling was mutual. And so they had rather a madcap affair together that they kept fairly clandestine until his wife passed on, and then they eventually married. It was known at the time but not spoken of in polite company. It was very radical for her to live that kind of a lifestyle. Number one, to be this successful person doing this thing on her own within a bigger company, to have built her career in the way that she did, and then to also be having a thing with the boss. That was definitely not something that was considered the normal, acceptable route for women at the time, and she just didn't care, and she just lived her life and did what she wanted to do, and was quite a personality. She appeared in over 360 publicity items, which was very unusual at the time. This particular one, for her, is relatively demure, but you certainly get the idea behind her work. Lots of color. Lots of fun, lots of geometry. The tree really is the feature, the circle tree in this particular line. A lot of her stuff was just geometrics and really strong patterns. And she inspired an entire group of other women to put themselves out there in the pottery industry, including Susie Cooper, whose Art Deco designs became very, very well known. A lot of English celebrities were hired to do promotional pieces for the firm and to promote her ware, and it was really celebrated at the time. By the 1940s, she had retired. Her name was being used for pretty standard transfer ware like the Tonkin pattern, which does not have the collector following that this does. By then, she'd pretty much checked out of the business and was at home having nice gardens and living with her then husband and having a more normal life. But she was really something in her time, and her bizarre ware was really something in its time. I have always wanted to own a piece. This is the first time one has come my way, and I'm going to put it out on the market. I believe it is worth somewhere between $175 and $200. Very excited to have this, very excited to share this with you, and always very excited to put these presentations together and share all of this information with you. I just really enjoy the antiques and vintage. I love trying to find new things that we haven't talked about before, or to find different things that we can amplify. The stories and the people behind this stuff are just as cool as the items in a lot of cases, and the collectors of these items are just as cool too, because they get it, and I'm just so glad to share this with you so that you can appreciate these wonderful things the way that I do. So check this out on eBay. If the items are still for sale, you can check the listings, click the links to go to them, make a bid if you're interested in them, follow along if you're just interested in seeing how things do in the marketplace. I'm the Antique Nomad on eBay, and you can always check my completed listings if you're able to access them to figure out how things did. But we'll also have a video next month to tell you how we did with these 20 items on eBay.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video, and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help, and we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.